In 1847, the merchant's house stood as a symbol of certainty in a world built on rigid order. It was not the largest estate in the region, but it was among the most respected, a place where wealth was quiet yet unquestioned. The merchant himself had earned his position through decades of calculated trade, cotton, tobacco, shipping contracts, and carefully chosen alliances. His name appeared on ledgers, contracts, and invitations to civic gatherings, always spoken with a tone that suggested trust and authority. To the outside world, his household represented success achieved through discipline, restraint, and an unbending respect for social rules. Inside those walls, everything followed a strict rhythm designed to preserve that image. From a young age, the merchant's son was taught that he did not belong to himself. His life was an extension of the family legacy, shaped by expectations rather than desire. Tutors arrived early each morning to instruct him in arithmetic, correspondence, and the proper language of business. Afternoons were spent walking through warehouses and offices, listening as his father explained profit margins and partnerships, impressing upon him that emotion had no place in trade. Even his posture, his tone of voice, and the way he entered a room were corrected when they failed to reflect confidence and control. The boy learned quickly that approval was conditional, granted only when he mirrored the man his father expected him to become. The house itself reinforced these lessons. Its rooms were arranged not for comfort, but for presentation. Parlors were kept immaculate for guests who might arrive unannounced. Dining tables were set long before meals, polished until they reflected candlelight perfectly. Servants moved quietly, almost invisibly, trained to anticipate needs before they were spoken. Any sign of disorder was treated as a threat, not just to daily routine, but to reputation. The merchant believed that chaos, once allowed inside a home, would eventually spill into business and public life. Control, therefore, was everything. Among those who maintained this order were the enslaved people who lived and worked on the property. They were essential to the household's operation, yet deliberately unseen in the narrative the family told about itself. To visitors, they were background figures, silent, obedient, interchangeable. Their labor sustained the household's elegance, but their presence was never acknowledged beyond necessity. They were spoken to in commands, not conversations, and their lives beyond assigned tasks were considered irrelevant. This deliberate blindness allowed the family to believe in its own civility without confronting the human cost that supported it. One of these enslaved workers was a young woman who had arrived at the house years earlier, her age and origins barely recorded. She had learned quickly how to move without drawing attention, how to keep her eyes lowered and her expression neutral. She understood that safety came from predictability, from becoming so consistent in her behavior that no one felt the need to notice her at all. Each day followed the same pattern: early mornings preparing rooms, long hours attending to household needs, evenings spent cleaning the traces of the family's life so that each new day could begin without evidence of the last. Her world was confined to these routines, yet within them she observed everything. She noticed how the merchant's voice softened when speaking to important guests, how his authority sharpened when addressing those beneath him. She saw the way the son listened more than he spoke, absorbing expectations like lessons carved into stone. From her position on the margins, she became an unintentional witness to the family's private rhythms. The arguments behind closed doors, the silences that followed disappointment, the subtle tension that settled over the house whenever the son failed to meet his father's standards. She learned these things not because anyone confided in her, but because invisibility made her present in moments others forgot to guard. The son, for his part, experienced the house differently. To him, it was both shelter and prison. Every room carried reminders of what he was supposed to become, and every interaction reinforced the narrow path laid out before him. He was admired in public, praised as a promising young man, yet rarely asked what he wanted. His future had already been drafted: a respectable marriage, an expanded business, children raised to continue the cycle. Even his moments of rest felt supervised, as if leisure itself required justification. The house did not simply contain him, it shaped him. As he grew older, the contrast between the family's polished exterior and its internal rigidity became harder to ignore. He began to sense that the respect his father commanded was built as much on fear as on admiration. Employees deferred, partners agreed quickly, and servants obeyed without hesitation. The system worked, but it left little room for vulnerability or deviation. Any weakness, his father often warned, would invite exploitation. Strength meant consistency, and consistency meant never questioning the rules that upheld their position. Within this environment, the enslaved woman existed as part of the structure, yet separate from it. She did not belong to the family's future plans, nor to its public image, except as an unspoken necessity. Her presence was normalized to the point of invisibility, which allowed her to see the household with a clarity denied to those invested in its mythology. She saw how respectability could coexist with cruelty, how kindness could be selective, and how power shaped every interaction, even those that appeared ordinary. To her, the house was not a symbol of success, but a carefully maintained illusion. The merchant took pride in this illusion. He believed deeply in hierarchy, convinced that society functioned best when everyone knew their place and remained within it. To him, the arrangement of his household was not immoral, but natural. He saw himself as fair, even generous, providing shelter and order to those under his control. Any challenge to this worldview felt like a personal attack, not just on his authority, but on the moral framework that justified his success. His certainty left little room for doubt, and he raised his son to inherit that certainty along with everything else. Yet beneath this rigid structure, small fractures existed. The son's growing awareness of these cracks did not come from rebellion, but from observation. He noticed moments when the house's smooth surface faltered, when a servant's hesitation revealed fear, when his father's anger betrayed insecurity, when silence followed an unspoken truth. These moments unsettled him, not because he understood them fully, but because they hinted at a reality more complex than the one he had been taught to accept. He began to realize that control did not eliminate vulnerability, it merely concealed it. The enslaved woman, though constrained by her position, shared this awareness in her own way. She understood that the household's stability depended on silence, hers and others. Speaking, questioning, or even reacting could disrupt the fragile balance that kept punishment at bay. Survival required restraint, patience, and the ability to read unspoken rules. Over time, this vigilance sharpened her perception, allowing her to sense shifts in mood and intention before they became visible. She lived within the house's order, but she was never deceived by it. This was the world in which both the merchant's son and the enslaved woman existed, a space defined by power, expectation, and carefully managed appearances. Their lives intersected daily without acknowledgement, shaped by the same structure yet constrained by vastly different consequences. The house did not merely shelter them, it enforced a hierarchy that dictated how they moved, spoke, and even thought. It was a place where respectability masked injustice, and where the illusion of order depended on the quiet suffering of those denied a voice. By 1847, the merchant believed his household to be secure, his legacy assured. He saw no reason to question the system that had brought him success, nor the future he had arranged for his son. The routines continued, the image remained intact, and the house stood as it always had, calm, controlled, and admired. Yet beneath this surface, unspoken tensions lingered, shaped by observation, restraint, and the quiet accumulation of thoughts that could not yet be expressed. In that silence, the conditions for something dangerous were already forming, though no one within the household was prepared to name it. At first, nothing about the way the merchant's son noticed her felt unusual to him. She was simply there, moving through the house as she always had, performing tasks so efficiently that she blended into the background. He had seen her countless times before without truly seeing her. But as the months passed, something subtle shifted. His eyes began to follow her longer than necessary, not out of intention but instinct. He caught himself watching the way she folded linens with careful precision, the way she paused before speaking to ensure her tone was properly measured, the way she seemed to anticipate needs before they were voiced. These were small details, easily dismissed, yet they lingered in his thoughts long after he left the room. What unsettled him most was not attraction, but awareness. He began to notice how differently the house treated her compared to everyone else. Orders were given without explanation, praise was rare, correction immediate. Where others were allowed moments of rest or conversation, she remained perpetually alert, as though the slightest misstep could carry consequences he did not fully understand. This awareness made him uncomfortable, because it revealed a gap between the values he had been taught to respect and the reality unfolding before him each day. He told himself these observations meant nothing, that they were simply the byproduct of spending too much time within the same walls. Still, he could not stop noticing. Their first real interaction was unremarkable. He asked her to carry a stack of papers from one room to another, a task any servant might perform. She did so without meeting his eyes, responding softly, as she had been trained. Yet in that brief exchange, he sensed something he could not name, a tension that did not exist in his interactions with others. It was not defiance nor fear exactly, but an awareness that they occupied fundamentally different worlds. When she handed him the papers, their fingers brushed for an instant. The contact was accidental, fleeting, and entirely improper. He withdrew his hand immediately, startled by the intensity of his own reaction. After that moment, he became hyper-aware of her presence. He noticed when she entered a room, when she left, when her routine shifted even slightly. He tried to rationalize this attention as curiosity, convincing himself that it stemmed from a desire to understand the household better. But deep down, he recognized that his interest had crossed into something more dangerous. The rules governing his life were clear, and this was a boundary he was never meant to approach. The fact that he was thinking about it at all felt like a quiet betrayal of everything he had been raised to believe. She too sensed the change, though she understood it differently. Years of living under constant scrutiny had taught her to recognize subtle shifts in behavior. She noticed when his gaze lingered, when his tone softened, when his presence felt closer than it needed to be. These signals did not bring excitement, they brought caution. She knew better than to misinterpret attention from someone with power. Interest could quickly turn into danger, and kindness could vanish without warning. Her survival depended on maintaining distance, on ensuring that no interaction could be misconstrued as invitation or familiarity. Despite her efforts, circumstances continued to place them near one another. The son found reasons to remain in common areas longer than necessary, to ask questions that required brief responses. He told himself these were harmless, even polite, but each interaction chipped away at the careful distance she tried to maintain. She answered him respectfully, never volunteering information, never allowing her expression to reveal more than neutrality. Yet even this restraint seemed to draw him in further. He began to sense that behind her controlled exterior was a depth of experience he had never been forced to confront. As days turned into weeks, his internal conflict intensified. He knew precisely what society would say if his thoughts were exposed. Desire alone would be condemned, regardless of action. He imagined his father's reaction, disbelief, then rage, followed by swift, decisive punishment. The fear of that outcome should have been enough to extinguish whatever feelings were forming. Instead, it sharpened them. The forbidden nature of his thoughts made them harder to dismiss, as though the very act of resisting gave them greater power. He tried to redirect his attention. He spent more time away from the house, immersed himself in business matters, sought distraction in social gatherings where appropriate companionship was readily available. Yet, even in these spaces, his mind wandered back to the quiet moments within the household. The laughter of well-dressed women felt hollow, their conversations predictable. He realized with discomfort that his interest was not rooted in novelty, but in contrast. With her, there was no performance, no expectation of charm or ambition. There was only presence, shaped by necessity and endurance. She remained wary. Every interaction carried risk, and she weighed each word carefully. She understood that his attention, however restrained, placed her in a precarious position. If noticed by others, it could be interpreted as impropriety on her part, regardless of truth. Punishment would not fall evenly. It never did. The imbalance of power defined every aspect of their lives, and she could not afford to forget it, even for a moment. Still, she could not entirely ignore the change either. His manner was different from that of others, less commanding, more uncertain. That uncertainty unsettled her, because it did not fit neatly into the patterns she relied upon for safety. Their glances became more frequent, though neither acknowledged them. When their eyes met, both looked away quickly, as if caught doing something wrong. These moments were brief, but charged, filled with unspoken awareness. He felt them like a question he did not know how to answer. She felt them like a warning she could not escape. Neither spoke of what was happening, yet both carried its weight. At night, the son lay awake replaying these interactions in his mind. He questioned his own motives, searching for explanations that would absolve him of guilt. He told himself that empathy was not a crime, that noticing another human being did not make him immoral. But even as he constructed these arguments, he knew they were incomplete. What he felt went beyond concern or curiosity. It unsettled the foundation of his identity, forcing him to confront the possibility that the world he had accepted without question was deeply flawed. For her, nights were not a space for reflection but for recovery. Exhaustion left little room for indulgent thought, yet even she could not entirely suppress the awareness that something was changing. She sensed it in the atmosphere of the house, in the way tension seemed to gather in small, unnoticed places. She reminded herself constantly of the risks, of the history written into her position. Desire, she knew, was a luxury she could not afford. Any shift in behavior, any misinterpretation could be catastrophic. The danger lay not in a single moment, but in accumulation. Each glance, each softened word, each shared silence added to a growing awareness that neither could fully control. The house, with all its rules and routines, seemed suddenly fragile, as though its carefully maintained order depended on mutual restraint that was slowly eroding. Neither the son nor the enslaved woman intended to cross a line, yet both sensed how close they were drifting toward it. He began to realize that his feelings were not simply about her, but about himself. In noticing her humanity, he was forced to question his own role within a system that denied it. This realization frightened him more than the attraction itself. It suggested that the values he had inherited were not immutable truths, but constructs upheld by power and silence. Acknowledging this felt like standing on unstable ground, unsure whether it would hold his weight. She, meanwhile, recognized that his attention reflected a vulnerability she rarely encountered in those above her. It did not comfort her. Vulnerability in someone with power could be unpredictable, even dangerous. She had learned to trust patterns, not intentions. Still, she could not deny that his uncertainty marked a departure from the casual authority she had come to expect. This difference, however subtle, made the situation more complex than simple fear. What bound them at this stage was not action, but awareness. They existed in parallel states of tension, each conscious of the other in ways that could not be spoken. The glances that should never linger did so anyway, fleeting yet persistent. They were reminders of a boundary being tested, not by defiance, but by the slow erosion of certainty. In 1847, such moments carried weight far beyond their apparent insignificance. They were the first cracks in a structure built on rigid separation, and neither fully understood where those cracks might lead. By the time either of them acknowledged, even privately, that something dangerous was unfolding, the sense of inevitability had already begun to take shape. The glances, once dismissed as accidents, had become signals. The feelings, once resisted, had found space to exist. And within the quiet, controlled environment of the merchant's house, a tension now lingered, unseen, unnamed, but impossible to ignore. By the time they began meeting in secret, neither of them could honestly say when the decision had been made. There was no single M.O. meant of agreement, no whispered plan carefully arranged in advance. It emerged instead from hesitation layered upon hesitation, from chances not taken and boundaries approached but not crossed until one evening, almost without intent, circumstances aligned in a way that left them alone together longer than expected. The house had settled into its nighttime stillness, the kind that made even the smallest sounds feel exposed. Lamps were dimmed, footsteps faded, and the rigid order that ruled daylight hours loosened just enough to allow shadows to gather in unused spaces. The sun had lingered in a corridor he should have already left, his thoughts unsettled by the events of the day. She had been there as well, completing a task assigned late, her movements careful to avoid attention. When their paths crossed, both paused instinctively. The silence between them felt heavier than any conversation they had ever avoided. For the first time, neither immediately looked away. Fear rose quickly, sharp and unmistakable, but alongside it was something else, an understanding that retreat would not erase what had already formed between them. It would only delay it. Their first exchange in that quiet space was restrained, almost formal, as though politeness might protect them from the meaning beneath their words. He spoke softly, careful not to let his voice carry. She responded with equal caution, her tone neutral, her posture rigid with awareness of risk. Yet even in that controlled interaction, something irreversible occurred. They were no longer pretending not to see each other. The acknowledgement itself felt transgressive, as though naming a truth that had survived only because it remained unspoken. They parted quickly that night, each retreating with a sense of shock at their own boldness. Sleep came slowly. The sun lay awake, replaying every word, every pause, aware that what had happened could not be undone. He told himself it had been harmless, that no one had seen, that silence still protected them. But the realization that he wanted it to happen again unsettled him deeply. Desire, once imagined as a sudden force, revealed itself instead as persistence, quiet, patient, and difficult to resist. For her, the night brought no comfort. She understood the danger with clarity sharpened by experience. Secret meetings were not romantic fantasies, they were risks calculated under duress. History had taught her what happened when power and intimacy collided. Still, she could not deny the sense of inevitability that followed their encounter. Avoidance now required effort, and effort drew attention. She adjusted her routines, hoping to reduce opportunities for contact, but the house seemed to conspire against her caution. Their paths continued to cross, often at night, when vigilance elsewhere waned. When they met again, it was not planned, yet it no longer felt accidental. They exchanged few words, but their shared understanding deepened. Each meeting was brief, defined by restraint rather than indulgence. There were no declarations, no illusions of escape. The weight of reality pressed down on them both, shaping their behavior. He remained aware of his privilege, of the fact that discovery would not harm him in the same way. She remained conscious of the imbalance, never allowing herself to forget how easily consequences could fall upon her alone. Over time, these stolen moments developed a rhythm of their own. They met only in places least likely to draw notice: storage rooms, back corridors, spaces overlooked by design. Darkness became both refuge and threat. It concealed them from watchful eyes but magnified every sound, every movement. Their conversations were sparse, carried out in low tones, focused more on the present than the future. Planning ahead felt dangerous, as though imagining longevity might tempt fate. The son struggled with the duality of his existence. By day he fulfilled his role with renewed diligence, careful to appear unchanged. He attended to business, spoke confidently in public, and maintained the image expected of him. This performance felt necessary, a shield against suspicion. At night, however, that certainty dissolved. In the quiet spaces where they met, he confronted aspects of himself that did not align with the values he had inherited. He felt both alive and ashamed, empowered and frightened. The contradiction gnawed at him, yet he could not bring himself to abandon what he now considered essential. She navigated the secrecy with a different calculation. Every meeting required assessment: who might be awake, which routes were safest, how long she could risk being absent without notice. Her life had always demanded vigilance, but now the stakes felt higher. She did not indulge in fantasies of equality or rescue. What she allowed herself instead were moments, brief intervals where she could exist outside her prescribed role, where her thoughts were acknowledged rather than ignored. These moments did not erase her reality, but they altered how she endured it. As their connection deepened, the absence of promises became its own form of understanding. Neither spoke of love in terms that implied permanence. They shared glances, fragments of conversation, and long silences that conveyed more than words could safely express. The son sensed that naming his feelings would make them vulnerable, easier to condemn even in private. She understood that accepting such declarations could entangle her further in expectations she could never afford. Restraint became their shared language. The risk of discovery was constant. Sounds echoed more loudly at night, and the fear of interruption hovered over every meeting, a creaking floorboard, a distant footstep. Even a change in the air seemed capable of unraveling everything. Each time they parted, relief mingled with regret. Survival demanded caution, yet the desire to return drew them back repeatedly. The house, once a symbol of order, now felt unpredictable, its familiar spaces charged with possibility and threat. Their secrecy created a fragile sense of intimacy, defined not by physical closeness alone, but by shared risk. Trust, in this context, meant believing that the other would exercise restraint, would not act impulsively or demand more than circumstances allowed. He trusted her silence. She trusted his discretion. This mutual dependence was both grounding and dangerous, binding them together more tightly than either intended. The son began to recognize how little he truly understood about her life beyond these moments. He did not ask questions that might reveal too much, aware that knowledge carried responsibility. Still, he listened when she spoke of small things, fatigue, routine, the subtle indignities of daily existence. These fragments forced him to confront realities he had been sheltered from, challenging his assumptions about fairness and merit. The awareness that his comfort rested on her constraint unsettled him, yet did not drive him away. She, in turn, observed the limits of his understanding. His discomfort was real, but it existed alongside choices he would never have to make. She did not resent him for this. Resentment required energy she conserved for survival. Instead, she accepted the relationship as it was, constrained, temporary, defined by circumstance rather than hope. Any attempt to imagine more felt dangerous, not because she doubted her worth, but because she knew the cost of expectation. As weeks passed, the secrecy took its toll. The effort to maintain appearances grew exhausting. The son felt the strain of divided loyalties, his role as heir clashing with the person he became in the shadows. She felt the constant pressure of vigilance, aware that even a small mistake could have irreversible consequences. Yet neither suggested ending it. The absence of discussion did not signify indifference. It reflected an understanding that endings, once spoken, could not be easily reversed. Their meetings remained deliberately limited. Passion, when it surfaced, was tempered by caution. They learned to communicate through restraint, to find meaning in what was left unsaid. In a society governed by rigid rules, their secrecy became a form of resistance, though neither framed it as such. They were not attempting to challenge the system, they were navigating it, finding narrow spaces where humanity could exist without immediate punishment. The danger lay not only in discovery, but in attachment. Each shared moment increased the difficulty of separation. The son feared the day his father's suspicions might sharpen, when oversight would intensify and opportunities vanish. She feared the unpredictability of power, knowing that circumstances beyond her control could end everything without warning. These fears did not weaken their bond, they defined it. In the quiet darkness of the house, their affair existed as a fragile contradiction, intimate yet restrained, dangerous yet sustaining. It offered neither escape nor resolution, only temporary reprieve from roles imposed upon them. They understood, perhaps more clearly than either wished, that this secrecy could not last indefinitely. The system surrounding them was designed to expose deviations, to punish transgressions without mercy. Still, for as long as they could, they continued. Not because they believed in a future together, but because in those stolen moments they found a version of themselves. Vase, otherwise denied. The son confronted the limits of his inherited identity. She experienced acknowledgement beyond function. Their love, if it could be called that, was shaped by fear and necessity, existing only in the shadows where society's rules loosened just enough to allow it to breathe. In 1847, such an affair was not merely forbidden, it was unthinkable. Yet within the merchant's house, beneath layers of respectability and control, it unfolded quietly, sustained by silence and risk. Each meeting carried the awareness that discovery would bring consequences neither could fully escape. And yet, in choosing to continue, they accepted those risks, not out of recklessness, but because the alternative felt like a return to a silence more suffocating than fear itself. The first signs of trouble appeared quietly, in ways that could easily have been dismissed as coincidence. A servant lingered too long in a doorway, their expression unreadable. A conversation stopped abruptly when footsteps approached. The house, once predictable in its rhythms, began to feel alert, as though it were listening. The son noticed it before anyone else did. He sensed a change in the way people looked at him, the slight hesitation before answering his questions, the careful neutrality that replaced routine familiarity. Nothing was said outright, but the air itself felt altered, charged with unspoken observation. Rumors in a household like the merchant's did not announce themselves. They moved through glances and pauses, through shared looks exchanged when someone thought they were unseen. The enslaved people, accustomed to reading danger before it became explicit, sensed the shift quickly. Whispers passed in low tones, never naming names, never confirming anything directly. It was enough to suggest that boundaries had been noticed, if not yet understood. For her, this awareness tightened every movement. She adjusted her schedule further, avoided spaces where she might be seen alone, and spoke even less than before. Silence, she knew, was no longer merely a survival tactic, it was a shield under strain. The son, meanwhile, felt the pressure mounting in more subtle ways. His father began asking questions that seemed casual on the surface, but carried an edge of scrutiny. Where had he been so late? Why did he appear distracted during business discussions? The inquiries were framed as concern, yet the merchant's eyes lingered longer than usual, assessing rather than listening. The son responded carefully, choosing words that revealed nothing, but the effort left him tense. He understood his father well enough to recognize when suspicion had taken root. Once planted, it did not easily fade. The merchant had built his life on control, and any disruption to that control demanded immediate attention. He prided himself on intuition, on his ability to sense weakness or disorder before it became visible to others. The changes in his household unsettled him. He noticed that servants moved with heightened caution, that conversations seemed to stop when he entered a room. These signs did not yet form a clear picture, but they suggested something was amiss. Disorder, in his mind, was a threat to be confronted, not tolerated. He began to observe more closely, positioning himself in shared spaces longer than necessary, listening rather than speaking. His presence alone altered the atmosphere, drawing attention to routines that had once flowed unremarked. The son felt this scrutiny acutely. Each interaction with his father carried the weight of possible discovery. He doubled his efforts to appear composed, to project the confidence expected of him. Yet the strain showed in small ways: impatience, distraction, a sharpness in his responses that did not go unnoticed. The merchant interpreted these changes through his own framework of understanding. To him, deviation suggested weakness or indulgence, both of which he despised. He had raised his son to embody restraint, to prioritize legacy over impulse. Any sign that this discipline was slipping felt like a personal failure. He did not yet consider the nature of the deviation, he focused instead on its existence. Something was drawing his son away from the path laid out for him, and that alone was unacceptable. Within the enslaved quarters, the tension manifested differently. Fear sharpened awareness, and patterns were scrutinized for meaning. People noticed when she altered her routine, when she avoided certain corridors, when her exhaustion deepened. No one confronted her directly. Experience had taught them that questions could be dangerous. Still, concerns spread quietly. They understood better than anyone how little evidence was required for punishment and how quickly blame could settle on the most vulnerable. The possibility that she might be entangled in something beyond her control cast a long shadow. The rumors grew more defined as they moved, shaped by assumption rather than fact. A glance became a meeting, a pause became intention. In a household governed by hierarchy, interpretation did not require certainty. Suspicion alone was enough to justify action. The merchant sensed this shift and responded in the way he always had, by tightening control. Rules were reiterated, schedules adjusted, oversight increased. The house began to feel smaller, its hidden spaces exposed by heightened vigilance. The son felt the walls closing in. Opportunities for privacy diminished, and each day required greater effort to maintain appearances. He knew the affair could not survive this level of scrutiny, yet ending it felt impossible. The connection had become intertwined with his sense of self, offering a counterpoint to the rigid expectations that defined his life. Losing it meant returning fully to a role that now felt hollow. Still, the risk grew with every passing day, and the fear of consequences loomed larger than ever. The merchant's anger did not erupt immediately. It simmered, controlled and deliberate. He was not a man prone to impulsive outbursts. His fury, when it came, was calculated, directed, and devastating. He began by asserting his authority more overtly, reminding everyone in the household of their place. His tone hardened, his patience thinned. Servants responded with increased obedience, but the atmosphere grew heavy, as though everyone sensed that punishment was inevitable, even if its target remained unclear. Eventually, a moment arrived that crystallized his suspicion. It was not dramatic, no confrontation, no confession. It was a look exchanged at the wrong time, noticed by the wrong person. The merchant saw it clearly, understood its significance instantly, and felt a surge of rage that cut through his composure. To him, this was not merely a lapse in judgment, it was a violation of the order upon which his life and status depended. The implications reached far beyond personal disappointment. They threatened the very structure that validated his authority. His response was swift. He confronted his son privately, his voice low but filled with a restrained fury that left no room for denial. He did not ask questions in search of truth. He demanded answers to confirm what he already believed. The son, caught between fear and defiance, attempted to evade, to minimize, to frame the situation as misunderstanding. But the merchant was not interested in nuance. To him, the issue was clear. His son had allowed weakness to undermine discipline, and that weakness had endangered the household's stability. The confrontation marked a turning point. The merchant's anger expanded beyond his son, extending to the entire household. He issued new restrictions, enforced stricter supervision, and made his presence felt everywhere. The enslaved woman felt the shift immediately. Her movements were watched more closely, her tasks reassigned without explanation. The message was unmistakable. Scrutiny had found its target. She understood that even without proof, she stood in a precarious position. Power did not require evidence, it required only suspicion. Fear permeated every interaction. The son felt the weight of his father's gaze wherever he went, a constant reminder of authority reasserted. The house, once merely oppressive in its order, became openly hostile. Silence deepened, thick with unspoken threat. The son realized with sickening clarity that his position, though diminished, still offered him protection denied to others. This realization brought not comfort, but guilt. He had always known the imbalance existed, but now it pressed upon him with undeniable force. The merchant's wrath was rooted not only in betrayal, but in fear that his carefully constructed world might be exposed as fragile. He could not tolerate the idea that boundaries he enforced so strictly could be crossed within his own house. His response, therefore, was designed to restore control visibly and decisively. He believed that by demonstrating power, he could erase the transgression and reaffirm the hierarchy that sustained him. For the enslaved woman, the consequences were immediate and severe, though not yet explicit. Isolation replaced routine. Her interactions were curtailed, her presence reduced to function alone. She moved through the house under constant observation, aware that any misstep could be interpreted as confirmation of guilt. She did not protest. She understood the futility of resistance. Survival now depended on enduring scrutiny without reaction, on becoming invisible once more. The son watched this unfold with growing despair. His attempts to intervene were met with cold dismissal. His father made it clear that this matter was no longer open for discussion. Authority had spoken, and obedience was expected. The son's anger flared briefly, then subsided under the weight of fear. He knew that defiance would only worsen the situation, not just for himself, but for her. Silence once again became the only option. Within the household, everyone understood that a line had been crossed and that punishment was underway, even if its final form remained unknown. The tension did not dissipate, it hardened. Each day felt like a waiting period, a pause before an inevitable outcome. The merchant's anger, though controlled, permeated the house, shaping every interaction. His presence loomed large, a reminder that order had been challenged and would be restored at any cost. The rumors that had begun as whispers now carried a sense of certainty. People no longer speculated, they anticipated. The house seemed to hold its breath, suspended between exposure and resolution. In this atmosphere of fear and restraint, the affair that had once existed in shadows now felt unbearably visible. The secrecy that had sustained it could no longer protect anyone. What emerged from this period was not a dramatic reckoning, but a slow, crushing realization. Power, once threatened, responded not with explanation but with force. The merchant's wrath was not merely personal, it was structural, aimed at preserving a system that could not afford vulnerability. For those caught within it, especially those with the least protection, the consequences were already unfolding, written into the silence that now defined the household. What followed was not the dramatic reckoning one might expect, but something quieter and far more devastating. There was no public trial, no shouted accusations echoing through the house. Instead, consequences unfolded through decisions made behind closed doors, where power did not need witnesses to be effective. The merchant understood that spectacle was unnecessary. What mattered was restoration, of authority, of order, of the hierarchy that had been threatened. Everything else was secondary. The son learned of his father's decision indirectly through changes that arrived without explanation. Conversations ceased, privileges were withdrawn, plans that had once seemed inevitable were suddenly accelerated, reshaped without his input. His father spoke to him less, and when he did, it was in the tone one used for a subordinate rather than an heir. The message was clear, trust had been broken, and forgiveness was not guaranteed. The son's role in the household was no longer secure. It was conditional, subject to obedience and silence. For the enslaved woman, the cost was immediate and absolute. One morning, her routine was interrupted by an order delivered without emotion. She was to be reassigned. No reason was given because none was required. She understood instantly what this meant. Reassignment was not merely a change of duties, it was erasure. It severed connections, ended routines, and removed whatever fragile protection familiarity had provided. She was not asked for consent, nor offered explanation. Her life, as always, was subject to decisions made without her presence. The separation was swift and final. There was no opportunity for farewell, no shared glance to acknowledge what had been lost. The son became aware of her absence through its silence. The way the house felt suddenly emptier, stripped of something he had come to rely upon without admitting it. He searched for signs, for confirmation that this was temporary, but found no. Nay. Her name was not spoken. Her existence was treated as a problem that had been resolved simply by removing it from view. The merchant viewed this outcome as necessary, even just. In his mind, the transgression had been addressed with precision. He had protected his family's reputation, reasserted control, and demonstrated that deviation carried consequences. The system, shaken briefly, had been corrected. He did not reflect on the human cost of this correction because acknowledging it would undermine the moral framework that justified his authority. Order had been restored, and that to him was the highest good. The son, however, was left with a different reckoning. He carried the weight of responsibility in ways he had not anticipated. He could not escape the knowledge that his position had shielded him from the worst consequences, while she bore them entirely. This imbalance, once abstract, now felt personal and inescapable. He replayed their moments together endlessly, haunted by the realization that his choices, however restrained they had seemed, had contributed to her punishment. Guilt settled over him not as a sharp pain, but as a dull, constant presence. He attempted briefly to challenge his father's decision, but the effort was futile. Authority had spoken, and dissent was framed as further evidence of weakness. The merchant reminded him of duty, of legacy, of the dangers of indulgence. These lectures, once familiar, now felt hollow. The son listened in silence, aware that resistance would only harden his father's resolve. He was trapped by the same system that had protected him, unable to dismantle it without destroying his own future. For her, the journey away from the house marked the beginning of a new chapter defined by uncertainty. Reassignment meant adapting quickly to unfamiliar surroundings, new expectations, and new risks. She carried with her no proof of what had happened, no acknowledgement of loss. The connection she had shared existed only in memory, and memory offered no protection. Survival demanded adjustment, restraint, and the ability to endure without visible fracture. She had learned these skills long before, but the abruptness of her removal underscored how fragile even the smallest sense of stability could be. Time passed, as it always does, smoothing the surface of disruption without erasing its impact. The household settled into a new routine, one that conspicuously avoided mention of the past. The merchant resumed his role in public life, his reputation intact. Business continued, alliances held, and the image of respectability remained unblemished. To those outside the house, nothing had changed. The system had done what it was designed to do, absorb a threat and emerge unchanged. The son's life moved forward along the path laid out for him, though it no longer felt inevitable. Arrangements were made for his future, discussions held about marriage and expansion. He participated dutifully, aware that compliance was the price of continued belonging. Yet beneath this compliance lay a persistent sense of loss, not just of a person, but of an understanding he could not unlearn. He had glimpsed the cost of power too closely to forget it. He carried this awareness quietly, knowing it had no place in the world he inhabited. To speak of it would invite ridicule or punishment, and to act on it would require a courage he did not yet possess. Instead, it manifested in subtle ways: hesitation where certainty was expected, discomfort with authority he had once accepted unquestioningly. These changes did not go unnoticed, but they were tolerated as long as they did not threaten the system directly. The enslaved woman, meanwhile, adapted to her new reality with the same resilience that had sustained her before. She learned new routines, new expectations, new faces. The past became something she carried internally, unseen and unacknowledged. She did not indulge in bitterness, because bitterness required hope, and hope was a dangerous thing. What remained was endurance, shaped by the knowledge that attachment, however human, came at a price she alone was expected to pay. The story did not end with justice or reconciliation. There was no reunion, no confession that redeemed suffering. What remained instead was silence, imposed, deliberate, and effective. History often preserves outcomes that reinforce power while erasing those that challenge it. Names were not recorded, details omitted, consequences framed as necessary adjustments rather than human loss. The affair, if acknowledged at all, existed only as rumor, stripped of context and meaning. In this silence, the true cost of the forbidden love became clear. It was not measured in punishment alone, but in the way it reinforced existing inequalities. The system absorbed the disruption and emerged stronger, its authority reaffirmed by decisive action. Those with power retained it. Those without bore the consequences. This outcome was not accidental, it was structural, designed to preserve hierarchy at any cost. The son lived with the knowledge that he had been allowed to continue while she had been removed. This realization did not free him, it bound him more tightly to a legacy he now understood too well. His privilege protected him, but it also implicated him. He became both beneficiary and witness, trapped between complicity and regret. The question of what he might have done differently lingered, without resolution because the system offered no avenue for redemption. Her life continued elsewhere, shaped by forces beyond her control. She survived because survival was what she had always done. Yet survival did not imply forgetfulness. The experience became part of her understanding of the world, reinforcing lessons already learned about power, risk, and the cost of being seen. If she allowed herself to remember, it was without illusion. What they had shared had been real, but reality did not protect it. The merchant, in his final assessment, considered the matter closed. Order had been restored, and that was enough. He did not reflect on the moral implications of his actions because his worldview did not require it. Authority justified itself. The house returned to its appearance of calm, its routines uninterrupted. To those who valued stability over truth, this outcome appeared successful, yet beneath that stability lay an unspoken legacy. The forbidden affair did not alter laws or dismantle systems, but it left its mark on those who lived through it. It revealed briefly the human cost hidden beneath respectability. It exposed the imbalance of consequences, the way power shielded some while sacrificing others. These truths did not reshape the world, but they endured quietly, carried by memory rather than record. In the end, the price of the forbidden love was not paid equally, nor was it acknowledged openly. It was absorbed into silence, folded into the everyday operations of a society unwilling to confront its own cruelty. The system remained intact but not unchanged. For those who had seen its cracks, even briefly, the knowledge could not be erased. And though history chose not to remember their names, the story remained, a reminder that when love challenges power, it is rarely love that survives.